There are moments in life when the truth hits you like a freight train. For me, that moment came late one night, sitting alone in the living room with only the dim glow of the TV for company. I stared at the empty wine glass in my hand, trying to remember the last time Emma and I had shared a genuine laugh or even a fleeting touch. It felt like forever. Emma, my wife of 5 years, was upstairs in bed, or at least in the room we once shared. She had long stopped waiting up for me, and to be honest, I no longer rushed to join her. What was the point? Our marriage had become a lifeless routine. We didn't fight, not anymore. The silence between us was louder than any argument could ever be. When we first met, Emma was the most vibrant person I'd ever encountered. She had this way of lighting up a room, her laugh infectious and her energy magnetic. I fell hard, and I fell fast. I thought I'd found my partner, my equal, my everything. But now, sitting in that dark room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman I married was long gone, if she ever truly existed at all. The harsh realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Emma didn't love me. Not really. At least, not in the way I thought a wife should love her husband. To her, I was a provider, a steady paycheck, a name on a mortgage. I was stability, a safety net. And for a while, I think I convinced myself that was enough. But it wasn't. I had spent years trying to ignore the signs. The way she avoided my touch, the excuses she made to avoid intimacy, the look in her eyes when I told her I loved her. A look that screamed obligation, not affection. I'd chalked it up to stress, to growing pains, to the natural ebb and flow of marriage. But deep down, I knew better. I thought back to the last time we had an honest conversation. It was months ago, and even then, it wasn't about us. It was about bills, schedules, and logistics. Everything was transactional. I couldn't remember the last time we talked about our dreams, our fears, or even what we wanted for dinner without it feeling like a chore. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, I made myself face the truth. Emma didn't see me as her husband anymore. She saw me as a role to fill, a task to check off her list. And the worst part? I had let it happen. I had allowed myself to become invisible in my own marriage, hoping that one day she'd notice me again, that she'd look at me the way she used to, with admiration, with passion, with love. But that day never came, and now I wasn't sure it ever would. The weight of it all was suffocating. I wanted to scream, to cry, to wake her up and demand answers. But what good would it do? She'd probably just roll over, mutter something dismissive, and go back to sleep. Confrontation wasn't her style. Avoidance was. I set the glass down on the coffee table and leaned back, letting the silence engulf me. It wasn't just my marriage that felt dead. It was me. I had lost myself in this charade, pretending that everything was fine, that we were fine. But I couldn't pretend anymore. Something had to change. Whether it was me, her, or the entire damn relationship, I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this. I deserved more than a loveless marriage. I deserved to be seen, to be wanted, to be loved. That night, sitting alone in the dark, I made a decision. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep clinging to a past that no longer existed. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. It's funny how your brain clings to the good times when things fall apart. Like a cruel joke, memories of laughter and love play on repeat, taunting you with what you've lost. I used to love reliving those moments, back when Emma and I were at the start of something that felt like a forever kind of love. We met at a friend's party, one of those rooftop gatherings where people pretend they aren't freezing just to look cool with a drink in hand. I remember spotting her across the room, laughing at something someone said. Her whole face lit up like a Christmas tree. She had this energy about her, a magnetism that pulled me in before I even realized I was moving toward her. "Hi," I'd said, trying to sound confident but probably failing miserably. She turned to me, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Hi," she replied, her smile as warm as the drink I was nervously holding. The connection was instant, like something out of a rom-com. We talked for hours that night, completely ignoring the party around us. She was witty, smart, and full of life, and for some reason, she seemed genuinely interested in me. By the end of the night, we were exchanging numbers, and I walked home feeling like I just won the lottery. Our first date was nothing fancy, just coffee at a little cafe downtown. But it didn't matter where we were. We could have been sitting in a parking lot, and it still would have been perfect. Emma had this way of making everything feel exciting. She laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones, and she had this infectious laugh that made me want to keep telling them just to hear it again. The early days were a whirlwind. Dinners, late-night talks, spontaneous road trips. We couldn't get enough of each other. I'd never felt so alive, so connected to someone. Every moment with her felt like an adventure, and I was more than willing to strap in for the ride. When I proposed a year later, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We were sitting on a blanket in the park, watching the sunset, when I pulled out the ring. Her eyes lit up, and she tackled me with a hug before I could even get the words out. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes," she'd said, laughing and crying all at once. It was the happiest day of my life. Our wedding was small but beautiful. Close friends, family, and an overwhelming sense of love filled the day. I remember standing at the altar, watching her walk down the aisle, and thinking I'd never seen anything more perfect. She was everything I'd ever wanted, and I was convinced we were going to have the kind of marriage people wrote novels about. For a while, we did. The honeymoon phase was just as magical as everyone says it is. We couldn't keep our hands off each other, and every day felt like a dream. We talked about our future, about traveling the world, buying a house, starting a family. It felt like we had all the time in the world to build the perfect life together. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the wind. Little things, less laughter, fewer date nights, the occasional argument that lasted longer than it should have. I told myself it was normal, that every couple went through ups and downs. But as I sit here now, thinking back to those early days, I can't help but wonder when exactly we lost the magic. Was it after our first big fight? Or maybe it was when we stopped making time for each other, letting work and life get in the way. The truth is, I don't know when the cracks started to form. All I know is that the foundation we built our love on now feels more like sand than stone. It's painful to think about how far we've fallen. The woman who once tackled me in the park, who looked at me like I was her whole world, now barely looks at me at all. But despite everything, I can't bring myself to regret those early days. They were real, weren't they? Those moments of joy, of love, of connection. They weren't just a figment of my imagination. I hold on to those memories because they remind me of what love is supposed to feel like. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remind me of what I deserve to feel again someday. If someone had told me 4 years ago that Emma would one day treat me like a stranger, I would have laughed in their face. Emma, the woman who used to run into my arms after a long day, who'd trace her fingers over my face like she was memorizing every line. I would have bet my life she'd never turn cold. Yet here we were. I first noticed the change a year or two into our marriage. It wasn't one big moment, but a series of small shifts. The way she'd pull away from my touch, the excuses she'd make to avoid spending time together. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Life gets busy, right? We were both working hard, trying to build a future. But then, it became clear. This wasn't just stress. This was something else. I still remember the night I tried to reignite the spark. I'd planned a whole evening, candles, music, her favorite wine. I even cooked dinner, something I wasn't exactly skilled at. I wanted to surprise her, to remind her of how much we used to enjoy each other's company. When she came home, her reaction wasn't what I'd hoped for. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice flat as she shrugged off her coat. "It's a surprise," I said, trying to keep the excitement in my voice. "I thought we could have a nice night together." She looked at the table, then back at me, her expression unreadable. "That's sweet, David, but I'm really tired. Can we do this another time?" I stood there, dumbfounded, as she walked past me into the bedroom. The candles burned low, the food went cold, and I sat there in silence, wondering what I'd done wrong. That night, I decided to ask her outright what was going on. I followed her into the bedroom, determined to get answers. "Emma," I began, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Is everything okay? You've been distant lately, and I don't know what to do." She looked up from her phone, her expression a mix of irritation and indifference. "David," Not everything has to be about you. I'm just tired, okay? Her words stung, but I tried to push through. It's not just tonight. It feels like we're not us anymore. I miss you, Emma. I miss us. She sighed, setting her phone down. David, we've been married for 4 years. Things aren't always going to be like they were in the beginning. That's just how it is. But it doesn't have to be, I said, my voice cracking. We can work on this. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. She shook her head, her tone growing sharper. I don't need you to fix anything, David. I'm fine. Maybe you're the one with the problem. That conversation was a turning point for me. It wasn't just her words. It was the look in her eyes. There was no love there, no warmth, just apathy. After that, the distance between us grew wider. Intimacy became a rare occurrence, and when it did happen, it felt like an obligation on her part. There was no passion, no connection, just going through the motions. I tried to tell myself it was a phase, that she'd come around. But deep down, I knew better. Emma didn't see me the way she used to. And the worst part? I wasn't sure she wanted to. One night, I worked up the courage to ask her about it again. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the TV playing some mindless show we weren't even watching. Emma, I said, breaking the silence, do you even want to be married anymore? She didn't look at me, her eyes fixed on the screen. What kind of question is that? A serious one, I replied, because it feels like you don't. She finally turned to me, her face a mask of annoyance. David, just because I'm not hanging all over you doesn't mean I don't want to be married. Not everyone needs to be as clingy as you are. Clingy. That word cut deep. I wasn't being clingy. I was trying to save what was left of our relationship, but in her eyes, my efforts were just a nuisance. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized something I'd been avoiding for months. Emma wasn't just indifferent. She was checked out. Whatever love we once had, whatever connection we'd built, was gone. And I had no idea how to bring it back. Desperation makes you do things you never thought you'd do. It turns you into a version of yourself you barely recognize. A man clinging to scraps of hope, trying to piece together something that's already fallen apart. That's who I became in those months. Desperate David. The man who'd do anything to save his marriage, even when it was clear the battle had already been lost. I threw everything I had into fixing us. If Emma wasn't happy, I'd make her happy. If she wanted space, I'd give her space. If she wanted attention, I'd smother her with it. There wasn't a single corner of our relationship I didn't try to mend. It started with the small gestures. Flowers delivered to her office, her favorite takeout waiting on the table when she got home, handwritten notes tucked into her purse. I wanted her to know I was thinking about her, that I still cared. But instead of gratitude, I was met with indifference. David, you don't have to do all this, she said one night, pushing aside the sushi I'd picked up from her favorite restaurant. I want to, I replied, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. I want to make you happy. She sighed, barely looking up from her phone. It's just too much sometimes, you know? You don't have to try so hard. Try so hard. The words echoed in my head long after she left the table. Was that what I was doing wrong? Trying too hard? Still, I pressed on. I suggested date nights, movies, dinners, anything to spend time together. She agreed at first, but her enthusiasm quickly waned. She'd cancel at the last minute or spend the entire evening scrolling through her phone, barely engaging in conversation. It felt like I was dining with a ghost of the woman I used to know. When the little things didn't work, I moved on to bigger gestures. I planned a weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would help us reconnect. The trip was a disaster from the start. It's so far, she complained as we packed the car. Why couldn't we just stay in town? I thought it would be nice to get away, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She spent most of the drive with her headphones in, staring out the window. When we arrived, she barely glanced at the picturesque view before retreating to the bedroom with her phone. I tried to salvage the weekend with a romantic dinner and a walk by the lake, but she was distant and distracted, offering only half-hearted smiles. By the time we drove back home, I was emotionally drained. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Therapy was my last resort. I suggested it one night after another tense evening of silence. Maybe we should talk to someone, I said cautiously. Like a therapist? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, it might help us communicate better, you know? Work through whatever's going on. She hesitated, then shrugged. Fine, if you think it'll help. Her lack of enthusiasm should have been my first clue that therapy wouldn't be the miracle solution I hoped for. We went to a few sessions, but Emma's answers were clipped, her engagement minimal. When the therapist asked her how she felt about our relationship, she responded with a cold, "I think it's fine." Fine. That word haunted me. How could she think this was fine? After a few sessions, she announced she didn't want to continue. "I don't think this is helping," she said dismissively. I didn't fight her on it. What was the point? I'd exhausted every option, every idea, every ounce of energy I had. I was running on fumes, trying to fix something Emma didn't seem to care about fixing. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, the weight of it all finally hit me. I couldn't do this alone. I couldn't save a marriage that only one of us wanted to save. I had done everything I could. The ball was in her court now, but I had a sinking feeling she wasn't going to pick it up. I thought I'd seen it all, the indifference, the excuses, the cold, distant stares. But nothing could have prepared me for the day Emma dropped the bombshell. It was a Saturday morning, one of those rare days when we were both home at the same time. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, when she walked in. She didn't look at me, just breezed past and poured herself a glass of orange juice. "We should start trying for a baby," she said, her tone as casual as if she were suggesting we repaint the living room. I nearly choked on my coffee. "What?" She turned to face me, leaning against the counter. "A baby. It's the next logical step, isn't it?" I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "Emma, you're serious?" "Of course I'm serious," she said, as if I were the crazy one. "We've been married for 4 years. Isn't this what married couples do?" Her words hit me like a slap in the face. Married couples. Not us. Not you and me. Just some generic category we apparently belong to. "Emma," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "we haven't exactly been in a good place lately. Don't you think we should work on us before bringing a child into the picture?" She rolled her eyes, a gesture I'd grown painfully accustomed to. "David, not everything has to be perfect. People have kids all the time, even when things aren't perfect. But this isn't just about things not being perfect," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "We barely talk. We're not intimate, and now you want to have a baby? Why?" She shrugged, sipping her juice. "Because it's the next step. That's what people do, David. They get married, they have kids, they build a life. Isn't that what you wanted?" "What I wanted," I said slowly, "was a partnership. A life with someone who loves me, who wants to build something together. Not this." Her expression didn't change. If my words hurt her, she didn't show it. She just looked at me, calm and detached, like we were discussing the weather. "I don't see the problem," she said finally. "You're great with kids. You'll make a wonderful father. And what about you?" I asked. "Do you even want to be a mother, or is this just some checkbox you're trying to tick off?" That question seemed to catch her off guard. For the first time in a long time, she hesitated. But then she straightened up, her face hardening. "Why does it matter?" she asked. "You're overthinking this, David. It's not that complicated." Not that complicated. The words echoed in my head long after she walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the conversation. A baby. She wanted a baby. But not because she wanted to build a family with me. Not because she loved me. No, it was because it was the next step. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all finally became too much to bear. This wasn't just about the baby proposal. It was about everything. The distance, the indifference, the way she treated me like an afterthought in my own marriage. I'd spent years convincing myself that if I just tried harder, if I just loved her enough, things would get better. But now I saw the truth. Emma wasn't interested in fixing us. She didn't care about the cracks in our foundation. She just wanted to plaster over them and move on to the next phase of her life, with or without me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't do this anymore. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called a lawyer. I'm not ready to file yet, I told her. I need to know what my options are. She walked me through the process, her voice calm and professional. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I knew what I had to do. The decision to draft divorce papers wasn't made in anger. It wasn't a knee-jerk reaction or a petty retaliation. It was the result of years of trying, of bending and breaking, of realizing that no matter how much effort I put in, Emma wasn't willing to meet me halfway. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that morning, staring at my laptop as the lawyer's email came through. The attachment was there, a cold, unfeeling document that represented the end of everything I thought my life would be. My hands trembled as I opened it, reading through the lines that spelled out the terms of our separation. It felt surreal. Divorce had always been something that happened to other people. Friends, coworkers, acquaintances. Never me. Never us. But as I read through the document, I couldn't ignore the truth staring back at me. Our marriage was already over. The papers were just a formality. That night, I sat across from Emma at the dinner table, the envelope containing the papers resting on the chair beside me. My heart raced as I thought about what I was about to do. She sat there, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Emma," I said, my voice breaking the silence. She glanced up, her expression indifferent. "What?" "We need to talk." She set her phone down, sighing as if I were an inconvenience. "About what?" I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the envelope. "About us. About our marriage." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "David, if this is another one of your we need to fix things conversations, I'm really not in the mood." "It's not," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I've already tried to fix things. For years, I've tried. But I can't keep doing this alone." She tilted her head, her gaze sharpening. "What are you saying?" I slid the envelope across the table, the sound of it scraping against the wood echoing in the room. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me, confusion giving way to shock. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Divorce papers," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I've made my decision, Emma. This, whatever this is, it's not a marriage anymore. And I can't keep pretending it is." Her face went pale, her eyes wide as she stared at the envelope like it was a venomous snake. For a moment, she said nothing, and I wondered if she'd even heard me. But then, the silence shattered. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "Divorce? Are you kidding me, David?" "I'm not," I replied, my tone firm. "I've spent years trying to make this work, trying to get us back to a place where we actually cared about each other. But it's clear you don't want the same thing." Her hands clenched into fists, her face contorting with anger. "You're overreacting. All marriages go through rough patches. This is just a phase." "A phase?" I said, disbelief washing over me. "Emma, this isn't a phase. This is a pattern. You've made it clear over and over again that you're not interested in fixing things. You don't even want to try." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "So what? You're just giving up? Throwing everything away?" I shook my head, a mix of frustration and sadness bubbling to the surface. "I'm not giving up. I already gave everything I had. Emma, I tried, and I tried, and I tried. But I can't be the only one who cares about saving this marriage." Tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from sadness or anger. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't doing this to her, that this wasn't some punishment or act of revenge. But I knew she wouldn't understand. She couldn't, or wouldn't, see the role she played in the breakdown of our marriage. "I didn't make this decision lightly," I said softly. "But I can't keep living like this, Emma. I deserve more than this. We both do." She stood there, frozen, the tears spilling over as she stared at me. For a moment, I thought she might say something, might fight for us. But instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the papers and the suffocating weight of what I'd just done. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd finally taken a step toward reclaiming my life. Sadness for the love we'd lost, for the dreams that would never come true. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own story. You'd think the hardest part of ending a marriage is the decision itself. It's not. The hardest part is everything that comes after. The pleading, the bargaining, the guilt-tripping. Emma wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and she made sure I felt the weight of her every effort to keep me tethered to her. The day after I handed her the divorce papers, the silence in the house was deafening. She didn't speak to me all morning, didn't even look in my direction. Part of me thought she'd given up, that maybe she'd finally accepted my decision. But Emma had always been unpredictable, and I should have known better than to underestimate her. That evening, as I was packing some of my things into a suitcase, Emma appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a red silk robe, one I hadn't seen in years. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, and she wore a look that might have worked on me once. "David," she said softly, leaning against the doorframe. I didn't look up. "What do you need, Emma?" She stepped closer, her voice dripping with honey. "I've been thinking, maybe we don't have to do this. Maybe we can start over." I paused, finally glancing at her. "Start over?" She nodded, taking another step closer. "Yes, I know I've been distant, but I want to make it right. I want to be the wife you deserve." Her words were carefully chosen, deliberate. But I could see through them. This wasn't about love or regret. It was about control. "Emma," I said, my tone even, "this isn't going to work." She tilted her head, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "What do you mean?" I gestured to the robe, the sultry look in her eyes. "This, whatever this is, it's too late." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought she might drop the act. But instead, she doubled down, stepping closer until she was standing right in front of me. "It doesn't have to be too late," she said, her fingers brushing against my arm. "We can fix this, David. We can go back to how things used to be." I took a step back, creating distance between us. "No, Emma, we can't. You don't get to ignore me for years and then act like everything's fine just because I've finally had enough." Her expression hardened, the seductive facade cracking. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I am." The anger came quickly, her voice rising as she followed me around the room. "You're so selfish, David. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? We built a life together, and you're just, what? Running off because things got hard?" I stopped and turned to face her, my patience wearing thin. "This isn't about things getting hard, Emma. It's about the fact that you stopped caring. You gave up on us a long time ago, and now you're trying to manipulate me into staying because it's convenient for you." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she crossed her arms, her tone icy. "You think you're so noble, don't you? Like you're some victim in all of this." "I'm not a victim," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm also not going to let you guilt me into staying in a marriage that's been dead for years." For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, she let out a bitter laugh. "Fine, go. But don't come crawling back when you realize you've made the biggest mistake of your life." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I picked up my suitcase and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there with her anger and her empty threats. As I left the house that night, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Emma's attempts to manipulate me had only solidified my decision. I wasn't going to let her control me anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally free. You'd think walking out the door would be the end of it. That once you've made the decision, packed your bags, and said your goodbyes, the chapter would close neatly behind you. But with Emma, nothing was ever that simple. The first few days after I left were a blur. I moved in with my sister temporarily, her spare room a makeshift haven, as I tried to piece together what my life would look like now. It felt strange waking up in a place that wasn't my home, but it was also a relief. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of Emma's indifference pressing down on me. But Emma wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. It started with the texts. At first, they were sporadic. I miss you. Can we talk? Don't throw this away, David. I ignored them, thinking she'd eventually stop. But she didn't. The messages became more frequent, more desperate. Please come back. I'll change, I promise. We can make this work. Just give me one more chance. I can't do this without you. The guilt was heavy, but I reminded myself of all the years I'd spent trying to fix something Emma didn't care about. Her sudden urgency wasn't love. It was control, a last-ditch effort to keep me under her thumb. When the text didn't work, she moved on to voicemails. Long, rambling messages that ranged from tearful apologies to angry accusations. You're being selfish, David. You're throwing everything away. How could you do this to me? To us? Don't you remember how much we loved each other? We can have that again. Each message felt like a tug-of-war with my emotions. But no matter how much she tried to pull me back, I held my ground. Then came the photos. She sent me pictures of herself, smiling, laughing, dressed in outfits I hadn't seen her wear in years. It was like she was trying to remind me of the woman I fell in love with, the version of herself she hadn't been in a long time. There was one picture in particular that nearly broke me. It was of the two of us on our honeymoon, sitting on a beach, her head resting on my shoulder. She captioned it, "Remember this? We can get back to this, David. Please." For a moment, I almost believed her. I almost picked up the phone, almost let the nostalgia pull me back into her orbit. But then I remembered the years of loneliness, the nights I spent wondering if I was invisible to her. The memory of that hurt was enough to keep me from responding. Eventually, her tone shifted. When sweet words and promises didn't work, she resorted to anger. "You're pathetic," one text read. "You're just running away because you couldn't handle being a real husband." Another voicemail was even harsher. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. I hope you're happy being alone, because no one else will ever put up with you." Her words stung, but they also reinforced why I had to leave. Emma wasn't sorry for how she treated me. She was sorry for losing control. In those first few weeks, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, and even guilt. But as time passed, the fog began to lift. I started to see Emma's actions for what they were: manipulation, plain and simple. One night, my sister found me sitting on the couch, staring at my phone. "She's still texting you?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Yeah," I admitted. She sat down beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "David, you need to block her. She's not going to stop until you make it clear that she can't keep doing this to you." It took me a while to take her advice. Blocking Emma felt like a final nail in the coffin, a definitive end to something I'd spent years trying to save. But when I finally did it, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The silence was deafening at first, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under Emma's shadow. I wasn't carrying the weight of her indifference or her manipulation. I was free to focus on myself, to rebuild my life on my own terms. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to live again. Moving out of the house I once called home felt like stepping into an entirely new world. I won't lie, there were moments I questioned if I had made the right decision. Divorce doesn't just end a marriage. It uproots your sense of identity, especially when you've been tied to someone for years. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I found a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, but it was mine. There were no shared spaces with memories of strained dinners or silent nights. No reminders of Emma's cold indifference. It was just me, four walls, and the promise of a fresh start. I threw myself into redecorating the place, filling it with things that reflected who I was, not who I had been in my marriage. Art pieces I'd always wanted but never bought, a vintage record player, shelves lined with books I hadn't had time to read. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a space that truly belonged to me. Work became my anchor. I buried myself in projects, staying late at the office and volunteering for tasks I would have avoided before. My coworkers noticed the change in me. "You look lighter," one of them said one day during lunch. I laughed, shrugging it off. Yeah, I guess I am. And I was. The weight of pretending, of trying to hold together a marriage that had long since fallen apart, was gone. In my free time, I reconnected with friends I drifted away from during my marriage. I hadn't realized how isolated I'd become until I started reaching out, one text at a time. They welcomed me back with open arms, and before I knew it, my weekends were filled with game nights, hiking trips, and long conversations over beers. I also rediscovered old hobbies, things I'd let fall to the wayside while trying to salvage my relationship with Emma. I picked up my guitar again, strumming chords late into the night. I started running in the mornings, finding solace in the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. But the biggest change wasn't what I was doing. It was how I felt. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I didn't feel the constant pressure to be someone I wasn't just to please someone who didn't see me. That peace, however, was occasionally disrupted by Emma's lingering presence. Even after blocking her on my phone, she found ways to reach out. Emails with subject lines like, "Can we talk?" or "I'm sorry" would appear in my inbox, each one tugging at the part of me that still cared about her, even if only out of habit. I didn't respond. I couldn't. One day, while unpacking a box in my new apartment, I found an old photo of us. It was from our honeymoon. Emma laughing as we stood on a beach, the ocean behind us. I sat there staring at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the photo with the person she'd become. I didn't feel anger or regret as I looked at it. What I felt was something closer to acceptance. That chapter of my life was over. It hadn't ended the way I hoped it would, but it had taught me more than I ever wanted to know about love, loss, and the importance of choosing yourself when no one else will. One evening, my sister came over for dinner. As we sat on the couch, plates balanced on our laps, she gave me a knowing look. "You seem different," she said, her tone teasing but kind. "Different how?" I asked, taking a bite of my pasta. "Happier. Like you're finally starting to figure things out." I thought about her words long after she left. She was right. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. Life after divorce wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and full of moments where I still questioned myself. But it was also mine. Every decision, every step forward, was my own. And that, more than anything, was worth the cost of walking away. It was a Friday evening when I found out about Emma's new relationship. I was at my sister's house, sitting on the back porch with a beer in hand, enjoying the rare quiet moment after a long week. My phone buzzed on the table, and I glanced at the screen. It was a message from an old mutual friend of Emma and me, Matt. "Hey, just thought you'd want to know. Emma's seeing someone. Ryan, I think his name is. Bit of a character. Let me know if you want details." I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Details? Did I want details? I wasn't sure why the news hit me the way it did. I'd moved on, or at least I thought I had. But the idea of Emma being with someone else, especially so soon, felt like a punch to the gut. Curiosity won out. I texted Matt back. "What do you mean by character?" "Spill." His reply came a few minutes later, accompanied by a photo. It was Emma with a guy, Ryan, presumably, posing at some bar. He was tall but unkempt, his shirt wrinkled and his hair disheveled in a way that looked less intentional and more like he'd rolled out of bed 5 minutes before the picture was taken. Matt's next message was a little too gleeful for my taste. He's unemployed, lives with his mom, and spends most of his time working on his music. Thought you'd get a kick out of it. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Ryan was the complete opposite of everything Emma claimed to want in life. Stability, ambition, success, all the things she demanded from me. And yet here she was, smiling ear to ear with a guy who looked like he hadn't paid a bill in years. It wasn't jealousy I felt, it was disbelief. The absurdity of it all was almost comical. Emma, who had once chastised me for not trying hard enough, was now dating a guy whose greatest ambition was probably to get his demo played at a coffee shop. For a moment, I considered reaching out to her. Not to rekindle anything, I was long past that, but to ask why. Why him? Why now? Did she ever truly care about the things she said she did? Or had it all been an act? But I stopped myself. What good would it do? Emma's choices were hers to make, just as mine were mine. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the thought of her with Ryan. It wasn't the relationship itself that bothered me. It was the clarity it gave me. Emma's quick rebound and her choice of partner made one thing painfully clear. Our problems were never about me. I wasn't the reason our marriage fell apart. Her unhappiness, her indifference, her constant need for control, that was all her. I'd spent years blaming myself, wondering what I could have done differently, but now I saw the truth. Emma had checked out of our marriage long before I did. She'd been going through the motions, pretending to be invested, while I poured everything I had into a relationship that was already dead. One evening, I ran into Matt at a coffee shop. He grinned when he saw me and slid into the seat across from mine without waiting for an invitation. "So," he said, leaning forward, "what do you think about Emma's new guy?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my coffee. "Not my business." "Come on, David," he said, laughing. "You've got to have an opinion. The guy's a walking stereotype." I chuckled despite myself. "Honestly, I think they deserve each other." Matt raised an eyebrow. "That's a little harsh, don't you think?" "Not really," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Emma's choices don't surprise me anymore. If she's happy, good for her. But if she's not, well, that's not my problem." Matt nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You seem like you're in a good place." "I am," I replied. And for the first time in a long time, I truly meant it. Walking away from my marriage had been one of the hardest decisions of my life, but it was also the best one. Emma's new relationship was just another reminder of how far I'd come. She could date Ryan, or anyone else for that matter. It didn't affect me anymore. I was finally free of her expectations, her manipulation, her indifference. And as I walked out of the coffee shop that evening, the cool night air filling my lungs, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The chapter with Emma was over, and for the first time, I was ready to turn the page.